all. I hope all is well. To begin today, I want you to think to yourself, what is cannabis hemp to me? Now ask yourself, did I know that some of our first few presidents of the United States actually grew cannabis on their very own plantations? Yes, I'm talking about marijuana. You may have already guessed it, but I'm here today to discuss cannabis hemp with you and some of its history. To begin, I want to give you a little background knowledge about myself. Due to severe medical issues, I was one of the first under 18-year-old patients to receive a medical marijuana card in the state of Florida. Fast forward a couple years, I am now fairly healthy and also manage a hydroponic and organic garden center here in Tampa, Florida. My passion is learning, discussing, and teaching others about all types and all aspects of plants. Disclaimer, I'm not here to argue nor persuade whether it's beneficial to humans, whether people should have access to it, whether it's safe, or even should be used for anything at all. My goal with this presentation is simply for you to walk away knowing a little bit more about cannabis hemp's history, specifically prior to this millennium, than you did before this talk. First, I'll tell you some facts about the earliest known ancient history of cannabis hemp. Next, I'll discuss the Middle Age to early modern history. Lastly, I'll tell you a little bit about cannabis hemp through the 1900s until 2000. To begin, let's start out with the earliest known history of cannabis hemp. The earliest known evidence of hemp being used by humans traces all the way back to 8000 BC in Taiwan. According to the History of Marijuana article, scientists discovered hemp cords and pottery made during this time. In addition to that, the Columbian History of the World book stated, quote, the earliest known woven fabric was apparently made of hemp, dating all the way back in 8000 BC. Fast forward a few thousand years, the same History of Marijuana article mentioned prior says that scientists state that in China, cannabis seeds were used and oil were used for food in the 16,000 BC. Besides being used for food, the Chinese also used textiles made of hemp in 4000 BC. Also, according to the article, the first known recorded use of humans using cannabis as medicine was in 2737 BC by Emperor Shang Yang in China. During these and later times, there was tens of thousands of jobs, products, and industries that depended on the cultivation of what we modern day know as marijuana. Jack Hare, a very well-known cannabis rights activist and author, stated in his book, quote, for more than 1,000 years before the time of Christ until 1883 AD, cannabis hemp, indeed marijuana, was our planet's largest agricultural crop. According to an article from Hemp Tech Global, during these times, aside from being the primary source of protein for humans and animals, cannabis hemp was also used to produce things such as fuel, fiber, fabric, oil, lightweight boards and woods, diapers, feminine products, medicine, papers, and many other goods. As you can see, hemp was used for so many things throughout history. In fact, due to periods of shortage like in Virginia between 1763 and 1767, Jack Hare indicated that you could have even been jailed if you did not grow cannabis during these shortages. Hare also stated that in, quote, 1619, America's first marijuana law was enacted in the Jamestown colony, ordering all farmers to grow Indian hemp seed. More mandatory hemp cultivation laws were enacted in Massachusetts in 1631, in Connecticut in 1632, and the Chesapeake colonies into the mid-1700s. For over 200 years during these times in America, growing cannabis was so encouraged that you could even pay your taxes with it. Also, according to Hare's book, President George Washington and Thomas Jefferson both grew cannabis on their own plantations. At one point, President Jefferson even put himself at great risk to smuggle exceptionally good cannabis seeds back from China. Quote, the U.S. Census of 1850 counted 8,327 hemp plantations, meaning there was a minimum of 2,000-acre farms, growing cannabis hemp. That count does not include the hundreds of thousands of smaller farms that were growing less than 2,000 acres of cannabis. While you're thinking of how much cannabis and hemp we were using at the time, also consider that for those 200 years, we had to import 80% of America's cannabis hemp consumption from other countries. This meaning that those hundreds of thousands of acres that we were using to home grow our own cannabis only covered a fifth of how much we actually needed and used as a country. Now that you know a little bit about the earliest, ancient, and Middle Age history of cannabis hemp, I'd like to share with you a few pieces of cannabis history from the 1900s. The 1900s is where things such as laws and attitudes really started to change towards cannabis. According to an article published by History.com, In the 1930s, during the time of the Great Depression, the government turned their attention towards marijuana. They painted cannabis, along with the people and communities using it, which were at the time majority Mexican and Black communities, as a threat to what was already a struggling country and distraught. The government proceeded to begin the process of banning cannabis hemp. By 1931, 29 states had already outlawed cannabis. Not long after, in October of 1937, the Marijuana Tax Act was passed and signed into law by President Roosevelt. This quote essentially made the plant illegal in the United States. Fast forward a few years, President Reagan signed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act in 1986. This established mandatory sentencing minimums and raised federal penalties for the possession and distribution of cannabis hemp. This officially marked the beginning of the U.S. international war on drugs. In 1988, United States DEA Judge Francis Young states that marijuana should be reclassified as a prescriptive drug due to have clearly established valuable medical uses. Though Judge Francis's recommendation was ignored, 8 years later, in 1996, the use of medical marijuana for people suffering from AIDS, cancer, and other severe illnesses was re-legalized in California, which was originally the first state to ban cannabis back in 1915. Not too long after California, over time, similar laws have passed in other states. Between 1997 and 2001, in complete disregard to the International Institute of Medicine's recommendations, President Bill Clinton still attempted to continue Presidents Reagan and Bush's war on drugs. He did this by campaigning to arrest, prosecute not only state legal sick medical marijuana patients, but their providers as well. So today I told you just a few brief pieces of history about cannabis hemp, from its earliest known to ancient history, through the Middle Age history, all the way up to the early 2000s. During this presentation, I've discussed the brief history of cannabis hemp with a focus on the earliest known ancient history and all the history that took place prior to the millennium. I truly hope that everyone enjoyed this brief discussion as much as I did. Feel free to do some research of your own on cannabis. There's so much rich history behind this plant. Thank you all for listening.